officer.
Drug drops, calcium blocks, cooking this nerve in the nerve box. Dripping all these drugs, drip, drop, making sure the ACH in the nerve stops. This NMJ is gonna wither. This nerve ain't firing any quicker. Drugs working, the facts are sicker. Hopefully this frog has a sister.
This junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it. This junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it.
Sentinel cooling, woo, 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 woo. Blocking, I'm blocking, stopping, I'm stopping this nerve like I'm cool. I prevent ACH breaking you. Girl at the phase one block. This drug's calling the shots, like it or not. I tell the channel to close for me. I tell you the sodium is gonna be depolarizing nerve won't be jumping easy. I need a soul link for company. Hey, we block the most, yeah. Non-competitive mode, yeah. My cholin's a choker. Finding ACHR with closure. Paralysis the loser, muscle or a loser. This is a relaxing and a soother. Relaxing like usual, phase 2 blocking like voodoo.
Pew pew pew.
Intend to sell you like this. Hyposensitive, you might quit. ACH ain't affecting it. Nicotinic receptions, I'm losing it. Blocking, I'm blocking, stopping, I'm stopping this binding, increasing, no map fade. Quickly, this drug got a fast act rate. I'm locking on that way. Oh no, a ringer's wash. I flow that way.
Ribbit.
Off the nerve, girl, I have to say. Reverse the stop out of the NMJ, let the nerve take a
This
bath.
junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it. This junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it.
Curare finds I'm dropping, suddenly map increase. Cap is hovering, competitive antagonists, we know it's finding no acetylcholine. The drug is high, no depolarization, you're losing. Curare, bad and bougie. NMJ blocking is soothing. These muscles relaxing and loosen. Still be blocking ACHR ruler. Run against the ACH controller. When I'm present, your body's losing. No calcium means there's no moving. Curare attack, your life's concluding.
I block, I stop. I am not a weak inhibitor, so don't stop. I'm binding, I'm blocking. Calcium channels stay shut. Curare in full attack, huh? These muscles are gonna stop, huh? These receptors don't know it, just hit them. ACH frozen to get your map up.
Yeah, that way. Float in the plasma like a Segway. Yeah, that way. I trap ACH in the NMJ. Yeah, that way. ACH trap with no say. Yeah, that way. ACH stop, no muscle control, this is my game.
This junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it. This junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it.
Yeah. Frapable bad to the bone. Hey, wait, these channels be watching. I swear the receptors be closed. Yeah, hey, switch it from open to closed.
Like what?
RYR confirming, so no.
Ribbit.
Calcium can't be released, so no flow. Ooh. SR not open for you. Calcium ain't coming through too. Triple myosin ain't finding too. Active filament ain't gonna move. All of these ACs they hate. Try to hyperactive closest like AIDS. Look, go to the channel, signal is late. Yeah, so much inhibition that makes. Massive maps all up in your face. Yeah, but keep cap in its place. Poured it today. Yeah, the chamber was full. Yeah, watching the EP rise. Yeah, Kyle don't lie. Yeah, counting those beats like Pagey. Yeah, dropping for Rapmal so easy. Yeah, snapping to delay, no shaking, subtracting conduction velocity from latency. Hey, you know, for Rapmal winning. Yeah. This drug ain't losing. Yeah, reverse the effects, ring a solution. Took this drug once, my muscles ain't moving.
This junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it. This junction's bad and bougie. Caps look like they're not losing. The maps are slowly moving, decreasing as the drugs flow through it.
I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Jacob. Welcome to our lab.
This way.
Penthouse. Welcome to the lab. This is where the real magic happens. Thanks, Sid. Out here in the verapamil lab, where the real magic happens, after pouring the verapamil on the gastrocnemius muscle, it has effect on the NMJ, where it blocks the L-type calcium channels, which will ultimately prevent the DHP conformational change and ultimately prevent the RYR from opening. This will not change the muscle action potential or the compound action potential amplitudes, but it will decrease the muscle contraction. Let me take you over to the NMJ. Welcome back. So where I left off was with neurotransmission. So verapamil is going to have an effect on neurotransmission, but let me go through the normal neurotransmission of the gastrocnemius muscle. So what's happening is we have depolarization of this axon terminal, and this depolarization is going to cause depolarization of the presynaptic terminal, which will allow PQ voltage-gated calcium channels to open and allow binding of the synaptic vesicles that carry acetylcholine to be exocytosed from this presynaptic terminal. And acetylcholine will bind to the nicotinic muscle acetylcholine receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, at which point it'll cause an influx of sodium into the postsynaptic terminal, and this will allow the depolarization to spread to the adjacent membrane and down to the T-tubule, which will allow a conformational change in the L-type calcium channels that will ultimately open the ryanodine 1 receptor and allow calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm. Once calcium is in the cytoplasm, it will bind to troponin C and expose the actin to the myosin heads and allow for a power stroke and a muscle contraction. And when I was talking about verapamil will act on the L-type calcium channels, which will prevent the L-type calcium channels from having a conformational change that will open the RYR. And because of that, you will have less calcium that's going to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and you're going to have less calcium that's binding to troponin C, and ultimately you will have less actin that is exposed to the myosin heads, and you will not be able to have a muscle contraction. So ultimately, verapamil is decreasing the muscle contraction, but we are still seeing no change in the MAP and the CAP because the CAP is coming from the conduction of the action potential down that axon terminal, and that is staying the same, which means that we are still getting acetylcholine released, and we are still getting the acetylcholine that binds to the motor end plate and causing an EPP and muscle action potential. All right, let me send it up to the Frogos, Jill the Killer, and Sid the Kid.
Okay, so this is a graph of our MAP amplitude, and so this is what the expected results would be of adding verapamil. So we had our control, and this was the normal amplitudes, and then this was our drug, and so there's a decreased amplitude, which was expected. Okay, all right, so when we added verapamil, we noticed that the cap amplitude was higher for the drug rather than the control, and so what we're blaming it on is either poor connectivity to the wire at the nerve chamber, or when we had our control, it was probably warmer due to it being exposed to the air rather than putting the drug on and then taking it immediately after, so it could have affected our amplitudes.
So this is the effects of verapamil on the conduction time and synaptic delay of the frog NMJ in the sciatic nerve. So there are 4 sections total that comprise and make up the synaptic delay. Each one has an equation that in turn gets us to the end result. So we have the nerve conduction velocity, that's given by the equation of the measured distance between positions of the electrodes D and E in millimeters, and the change in the cap latency, which is in milliseconds. Obviously, when you divide millimeters by milliseconds, the end result is in meters per second. That is why you have the nerve conduction velocity in meters per second, not millimeters per milliseconds. The control for this value ended up being faster than the drug value. This could have been due to not giving the drug enough time to warm up to the system after the cold solution had been placed on it. So that is to be expected. Obviously, in an ideal system, all of these values should be the same, considering that the verapamil occurs at the postsynaptic part of the motor, or to make the motor neuron function. So it happens after all the action potentials have gone through, but it's not a perfect system. So the conduction time is off by 0.20 milliseconds. Obviously, that's also in conjunction with the distance between the negative recording and the negative stimulus electrode over the velocity. Obviously, since the distance is going to be consistent because it's just between the electrodes. It's not going to change, but the velocity changes. Since it's a smaller number for the verapamil, it's going to be a larger number for the conduction time because a larger number divided by a smaller number is going to get you a larger value. So next is the map latency. Those are going to be the same. That's to be expected. And that's just the time between the stimulus onset and the map onset. So those should be consistent throughout the whole drug series. And then we have synaptic delay. The equation is the map latency minus the conduction time. So like we said before, the map latency is the same, so nothing's going to change. But since the conduction time has to do with the velocity, and the velocity was smaller, you're going to see a smaller verapamil synaptic delay.
Hi, this is Stephanie, and welcome to the Frogos pen house. And this is where the magic happens. So, I have the cure for curare. Thanks, said the kid. So for curare, it has a similar structure to acetylcholine, so it is able to bind to the nicotinic muscle acetylcholine receptors. But it's a competitive antagonist to acetylcholine, so it's not able to actually activate the receptors, and that way we'll talk more about it. So the way that this works is that acetylcholine normally binds to these nicotinic muscle acetylcholine receptors and allows sodium to come into the cell and cause an end plate potential that eventually leads to the muscle action potential. But when curare is present, it competes with acetylcholine to bind to these receptors. So when curare is added, acetylcholine isn't able to bind to these receptors anymore, meaning that sodium isn't allowed to come into the motor end plate anymore. So without sodium coming into the motor end plate anymore, an end plate potential can't be generated since it's a graded potential, so you need more stimulus to create a larger end plate potential that ultimately leads to the muscle action potential. To explain our results, I'm going to send it over to Sid the kid and Jill the killer.
So when we added this drug to the NMJ of the frog, we had expected results, which was no change or no significant change to the cap amplitudes. When we added curare onto the NMJ, we had unexpected results. What we do see, or what we observed, was no change in map amplitude, and this is unexpected because in most cases we would see a amplitude of it being decreased, so this would be our expected results around here. So there's a difference, there's a change. Whereas in our observed results, there was no change. And then for our threshold, there was no change or no significant change, and that was expected.
Velocity, we see that curare has a decrease in the conduction velocity. This again could be attributed to the fact that the cold solution was placed on the nerve and not given enough time to acclimate back to the same temperature the control velocity was taken at, thus being a lower time. But this lower meters per second time, this lower velocity also is in relevance to the conduction time because of the equation used to find the conduction time. So if you have a smaller velocity, you're ultimately going to have a larger conduction time due to the distance, same distance, being divided by a smaller number gets you a larger value. And then in turn, the map latency is the time between the stimulus onset and the map onset. This is postsynaptic. This value is actually supposed to be much larger than 0.07, and this can be attributed to not enough curare being placed on the nerve. This is also due to it being a very competitive antagonist, and thus the map latency should have definitely increased for curare. The synaptic delay is then found by subtracting the map latency, conduction time from the map latency, and thus if your map latency, which should have been much larger, should have in turn made your synaptic delay much larger because of the conduction time. So.
What's up? My name is Jacob, and I go by Chef Sucks. Welcome to the penthouse. This is where the magic happens. I almost missed that one, Sid the kid. Welcome to the whiteboard, where I'm going to teach you about acetylcholine. What we do is we pour acetylcholine on the gastrocnemius muscle on the neuromuscular junction, right in the middle of the muscle. Acetylcholine is made of two acetylcholine molecules bound together. Since its structure is very similar to acetylcholine, it's able to bind to the nicotinic muscle acetylcholine receptor. Whenever it binds the nicotinic muscle acetylcholine receptor, it quickly unbinds and rebinds, and since it's not broken down by acetylcholine esterase, it just hangs out in the NMJ, causing a depolarizing blockade. Let me teach you a little more about it with the NMJ. Here we are at the NMJ. So the way it works is acetylcholine, since its structure is so similar to acetylcholine, it binds the nicotinic muscle acetylcholine receptors. And when it binds to these receptors, it causes their associated nicotinic channels to open, allowing sodium in. The cool thing about succinylcholine is it can't be broken down by the acetylcholine esterase enzyme. So instead of being broken down and emptying the NMJ of succinylcholine, instead it hangs around and continuously activates these receptors. What happens then is so much sodium is entering into the postsynaptic cell that the membrane is never able to repolarize actually, which means the voltage-gated sodium channels that are hanging out here all over the plasma membrane that initiate the MAP are never repolarized, and instead they stay inactivated because of succinylcholine. And that way, succinylcholine is causing a depolarizing blockade, and we would expect a decrease in MAP. I'm going to send it over to Sid the Kid and Jill the Killa to explain more about how our experiment went.
We added succinylcholine onto the NMJ. We had expected results. So the orange line is the succinylcholine, and then the blue line is the control. And so as we increase the stimulus amplitude, the cap amplitude increased as well, similar to the control. And then there was a 10 millivolt stimulus threshold distance, but that wasn't really significant results since there's a 10 millivolt grace period. When we added succinylcholine onto the NMJ, we had expected results with MAP amplitudes. So the orange line is the succinylcholine amplitudes, and then the blue line is the control amplitudes. And so when the amplitude of the stimulus increased, there was a decrease in amplitude for the succinylcholine, which is expected. And then we had a 10 millivolt, similar to the cap amplitude. There was a 10 millivolt increase, but that isn't significant because there's a 10 millivolt margin of error.
So this is the effects of succinylcholine on conduction time and synaptic delay of a frog gastrocnemius and sciatic nerve. As previously stated in my past two segments, we have the same 4 columns, and this one was actually turned out to be as expected. So all of our values match the control values. The fun facts about succinylcholine is that it does cause a depolarizing blockade, and this is important because it allows still some ACH to get into the cell, which allows for that MAP latency to ultimately be the same.
Seen the lab.
You've seen the drugs.
You've seen the frogs.
Time for you to rip it on out of here.
Gucci gang, Gucci gang, Gucci gang, Gucci gang, Gucci gang, Gucci gang, Gucci gang. Spread thin racks on new chain. My Esketittt. Love do Esketittt. Ooh, Esketittt. Esketittt. I forgot name. I can't buy Esketittt. Ain't nowhere to rain. Rather go and